Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. This is our weekly seminar series, which for this specific week is going online because our presenter, Dr. Claire Rosslyn Wilson, is beaming in from Barcelona. Now, the seminar series itself is coming to you from Canberra, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're here on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. And I want to acknowledge any Aboriginal people who are here on this Zoom today as well. So I'm Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. And I'm going to start by introducing Claire. Dr. Claire Rosslyn Wilson is a poet, researcher, and editor based in Barcelona. Claire develops video works that explore the unfamiliar, both in terms of unfamiliar places and cultures and the unfamiliarity of the more than human. Originally from Nam, and having worked for periods in Thailand, Singapore, and now Barcelona, Claire is particularly interested in how creative practice can be an entry point into exploring the unfamiliar and the unknown in an open and curious way. Claire has a practice-led PhD focusing on translocal creative practice. And Claire and I were just chatting because I spent a few months in Barcelona. So I'm particularly intrigued by this presentation because it's a place in which I guess I've had translocal experiences of my own. It's been the nub for a few creative works. So at any rate, without any further ado, I'll hand us over to Claire. Cheers.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the lovely introduction. So I'll just share a presentation here. So I want to firstly thank the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research at the University of Canberra for inviting me here today, and also for their support as with the Donald Horne Creative and Cultural Fellowship. So as part of the fellowship for this year, I'm working on a project called the Postcard Exchange, which undertakes an approach of close observation and multimedia creation to facilitate intercultural exchange and reflection about place, extending my practice-led research of intercultural video making. So the long-term aim of the project is to develop a framework of exchange that facilitates close observation and reflection in the environments in which we inhabit. Although the encounter with culturally unfamiliar places and the exploration of this encounter through creative practice can lead to personal growth and innovation, it can also lead to culturally inappropriate uses. Encountering the other can be an instance of uncertainty and risk, especially where it takes place in post-colonial contexts in which past acts of cultural appropriation, theft, and erasure have been the foundations for the context of cultural exchange. In this practice-led research project, it takes as a starting point a framework of reflective frames, which I developed through my creative PhD, to encourage creative practitioners to engage in ongoing and open-ended reflection as they create in an unfamiliar environment. The framework especially targets the challenge of perceiving clearly in intercultural contexts and the influence of past experiences and frames of knowledge in this process. So today I just want to outline a few of the ideas and ways of working that I developed through the PhD, which have now led into the project of the Postcard Exchange. And then also at the end, kind of open it up if anyone would like to participate in any way in the project. So how did I get into this area of creative practice focused on unfamiliar cultural contexts? Just to give a bit of an outline, I guess, of where I've been and what got me curious about all of this. So when I was a student, a high school student, I did a student exchange to Valencia in Spain for a year. And then later on at university, I went back for 6 months. And then later on, I sort of had this curiosity of continuing exploring these unfamiliar places. And I worked for a year in Thailand, in Mesot, and for 2 years in Singapore. I then was living or traveling between Barcelona and Nam from about 2015 until 2018 when I became a resident um, of Barcelona. So all of these travels I made freely. I wasn't forced. I was driven more out of curiosity. And I just wanted to mention all of this to kind of position my experience as a student, as a worker, and now as someone who's moved more permanently, as that has informed the way I think about living between localities and the translocal poetics. But let me first turn back the clock a bit to my first experience of living abroad, which was as a 15-year-old to Valencia in Spain for 1 year. When I first arrived, I was a bit of a disappointment, not just because of my lack of language skills, but also because I wasn't blonde with blue eyes and I didn't know how to surf. I wasn't the kind of Australian that they were expecting. On my return to Australia, my grandfather quizzed me about lazy Spaniards who took siestas. I thought about my classmate who slept 2 hours every day, and also those that shunned the idea of it. I thought about the long office hours. All that came to mind were the individuals. Perhaps if I examined the statistics, I could give a better picture of the attitudes of the traditional siesta. But what would that tell about my time in Valencia, which was actually what my grandfather was asking? I was tongue-tied. I couldn't tell him the stories that he wanted to hear. As I muddled my way through my stories, and as they didn't match up to his fixed expectations about Spaniards, I could see his confusion and resistance. Post-colonial literary theorist Tommy Baba refers to the dependence on the concept of fixity in the ideological construction of otherness in colonial discourse, explaining that, I quote, "The stereotype is not a simplification because it is a false representation of a given reality. It is a simplification because it is an arrested, fixated form of representation." My own understanding of people's lives in Spain evolved as I became more familiar with the routine there and as I got to know other families and their distinct ways of living. Any stereotypes I had were contradicted and complicated as I learned more. My experience navigating cultural difference that year had taught me to question my own assumptions about the way I see the world. It challenged me to do things outside my comfort zone, and it encouraged me to see things from others' perspectives. I began to realize how subjective and fragmented my perceptions were as I learnt more cultural cues and the language. This, of course, is not a unique situation, and in part is evidence of my position in a cultural majority that I had not encountered this until I was a teenager. However belated or naive my cultural immersion, it served to reframe my perspective. Yet, as I inexpertly navigated the space between cultures, there was a gap between the experience of living in a different cultural context and the way I communicated that experience. It was not the exciting stories of bullfighting adventures that I was interested in telling. It was the small details that led to my shift in perspective that I found to be the most important tale of my year in Valencia. Yet the rather dull story of how I got lost walking to school down what my local family considered to be a very straight road did not make good storytelling. Additionally, as I compared my awareness of the cultural context from when I first arrived to when I left a year later, I was acutely aware that ignorance is hard to spot in oneself. The awareness of the gaps in my knowledge kept me cautious about making sweeping statements about what Spain was like. So when I returned to these topics through my work in Thailand and Singapore, and later through my PhD, I knew what I did not want to do. I did not want to write about accounts of an exoticized other that were more imagined than real. I did not want to write about what literary scholar Yahan Ramazani refers to as travel or tourist poetry, which exoticized foreign places, fetishiously dwelling on the particulars. I did not want to create fixed stereotypes of reality, and I did not want to mislead myself about what I was really trying to achieve with the creative work. But was I falling into these tropes without realizing it? And was it even possible to entirely bypass these pitfalls? So when I arrived in Spain the first time, I decided to take classes in flamenco. I was a keen ballet dancer and I had been dancing intensively for many years, so I thought this could be a good way to connect with Spanish culture. But as the classes proved to be more frustrating than I anticipated, in spite of my experience in a number of different dance forms, while ballet focused on lightly drifting over the ground, making as little noise as possible, flamenco focused on flamenco drives into the floor, like, as one teacher put it, a fat granny. While ballet teachers had encouraged their students to project energy up and out, the energy in flamenco is forced in and down. Where ballet floats, flamenco pounds. These are simplistic analogies for two complex art forms, but during my flamenco classes, I felt like I was driving in two directions, fighting my ballet-trained body and trying to pull my weight down as if I were clasping at the strings of a helium balloon. It took at least one full year to bend the years of ballet training enough to stamp the floor with some conviction. And even now, my body holds the traces of that early training. When I step into a dance class, within 5 minutes, a teacher will ask, "You've done ballet, haven't you?" Reflecting on that year of struggling with the flamenco form, I wonder why it took me so long. Was I subconsciously resisting learning? Flamenco was a hobby while at the time I was still pursuing ballet seriously. Was I secretly worried that the influence of flamenco would taint my ballet practice with its distinct ways of moving? This story could be seen as a metaphor of two cultures pulling against each other, but it hints at the deeply embedded effects of practice. In his conversation with Michael Grenfell, Pierre Bourdieu explains that, and I quote, "The principle of practice is not a conscious subject, but something socially constituted, deeply corporal, in fact, a practical relationship with the world," end quote. While I physically had difficulty changing my muscles to an unfamiliar way of moving, I was perhaps also resisting new ways of doing and knowing. The ballet training is not only now faintly present in my muscles, I find it creeping into my approach to discipline or the way I'm very aware of the space around me. I find myself holding on to early lessons of discipline, hard work, and ceaseless criticism, perhaps even when I should let them go. I hold on to these lessons because I have internalized the values that underpin them. To think through the resistance I might have to unfamiliar cultures, either in the physical response in the example I've just given, or the more subtle biases that were preventing me from perceiving clearly, I turn to Bourdieu's definition of habitus, which at every moment structures new experiences in accordance with the structures produced by past experience. For Bourdieu, habitus helps shape ingrained ways of being and behaving, not just in terms of cultural or social understandings, but also in the way one is trained professionally and the intellectual frames one uses to contextualize information. The habitus tends to generate the reasonable and common sense behaviors, and only those, creating potentially closed loops that lack diversity. This can be a process that happens without conscious thought and which can lead to a person seeking out new experiences that reinforce past beliefs. Bourdieu explains this phenomenon, and I quote, "Early experiences have a particular weight because the habitus tends to ensure its own constancy and its defense against change through the selection it makes within new information by rejecting information capable of calling into question its accumulated information. The habitus tends to favour experiences likely to reinforce it." End quote. It is not just that there is a tendency to look for familiar patterns, but that information that can challenge the established ways of thinking are rejected. This can lead to people not only perceiving what they want to perceive, but also rejecting ideas that confront firmly held beliefs. Bourdieu developed his concept of habitus in the context of his work as a sociologist, in which he analysed, as scholars of cultural studies Tony Shiriato and Jen Webb argue, not only his subject matter, but the frame through which he researched, turning the instruments of knowledge he produced against himself. These filters shape the way one sees in a particular context in what sociologist Diane Ray refers to as, and I quote, a complex internalized core from which everyday experience emanates, a deep interior epicenter containing many matrices, end quote. This internalized core, shaped by one's origins, positions, and intellectual bias, informs the choices one makes, and it operates at an almost unconscious level. It is therefore difficult to be aware of, let alone change. As Ray argues, implicit in the concept is that habitus operates at an unconscious level unless individuals confront events that cause self-questioning, whereupon habitus begins to operate at the level of consciousness, and the person develops new facets of the self, end quote. Organizational psychologists Robert Kagan and Lisa Lascolehi similarly argue for the need to look at the filter and not just through it, highlighting, and I quote, the powerful though a given design might be, it almost inevitably is leaving something out, end quote. This process of reflecting, questioning, and carefully considering the assumptions one has is important in identifying one's habitus. However, this process of reflection is a practice that needs to be worked at and developed. As psychologist Daniel Kahneman highlights, although deliberate cognitive thought can identify biases, we can be blind to the obvious, and we are also blind to our blindnesses. Kahneman explains in his work on heuristics and biases as two systems. A system one, which is the experiencing self that makes automatic mental activities of perception and memory, and that can be informed by learnt expertise, and system two, that checks these insights through slower, more considered reasoning. He explains, seeing and orientating are automatic functions of system one, but they depend on the allocation of some attention to the relevant stimulus. He emphasizes that errors and bias can find their way into these systems. And I quote, because system one operates automatically and cannot be turned off at will, errors of intuitive thought are often difficult to prevent. Biases cannot always be avoided because system two may have no clue to the error, end quote. This system two, what Kahneman refers to as slow thinking, can catch the quick leaps or conclusions that might have been based on faulty or incomplete information from the experiencing self. This is reminiscent of the creative process where, for example, I might gain impressions from a social interaction and put it in a poem without being able to elucidate exactly what it was about the person's response that gave me that particular impression. However, it is in unfamiliar cultural contexts where these automatic leaps of the experiencing self can be especially problematic. Kahneman emphasizes that, and I quote, jumping to conclusions is risky when the situation is unfamiliar. The stakes are high, and there is no time to collect more information. These are the circumstances in which intuitive errors are probable. According to Kahneman, these intuitive leaps that might be based on incomplete information, memories, past experiences, or other sources such as priming, can be offset when a person learns to recognize situations in which mistakes are likely and try harder to avoid significant mistakes when the stakes are high. It is necessary to ask questions such as, what am I framing when I choose to focus a poem on a particular topic? Or what are my assumptions when I highlight a particular cultural encounter? I argue that this is a process of questioning and testing that must be repeated in cycles as the researcher gains new knowledge and therefore questions more deeply. So this reflection process is part of an ongoing and dynamic practice. Habitus is not something that is formed by one's past and that alone, but rather is something that evolves as a person incorporates more knowledge and experiences. As Webb highlights with regards to habitus, people have the capacity to evolve ways of thinking and doing as, and I quote, there is nothing natural or essential about the values a subject holds, the desires they pursue, or the practices in which they engage. We are the products of our history, but we are not its prisoners, end quote. This state of change, both in personal development of knowledge and in the development of the field, makes it imperative to continually question the frames through which one sees. We are not history's prisoners, as Webb says, but it takes a conscious effort to bring to the fore the internalized core in order to grapple with it, question it, and keep evolving towards more nuanced ways of perceiving and understanding. Reflecting on habitus and the way experience can subconsciously filter into ways of seeing and doing caused me to adjust my perspective, evolving my creative practice and challenging the ways I framed the research problem in what Kagan and Laskalahi explain as stepping enough outside our current ways of thinking and feeling that we have a chance to alter not only our behaviour, but the reality shaping beliefs and assumptions that give rise to our behaviour. Challenging one's current ways of thinking is particularly important in unfamiliar cultural contexts, where structures of past experience can lead to confusion or misunderstanding. Extrapolating on the dance example, a conviction that a classical approach to dance was the better practice might lead to resistance to learning something new on my part, and a confusion on the part of the flamenco teacher as to why I wasn't able to understand that approach. While I might retain a certain way of moving due to past training, what could be created if I embraced a more equal balance between the two forms? A purely classical way of dance might be adversely impacted by incorporating elements of flamenco practice, but I might gain a mixed and more innovative practice that is open to ways of doing. But to what extent is it possible to break away from this embodied history internalized as second nature and so as forgotten as history, and create new systems of practice that are influenced by an unfamiliar culture? These were kind of ideas that I was grappling with, particularly during my PhD research, where I was looking specifically at that moment when you are first introduced to an unfamiliar culture. So when you first move to somewhere else, and that initial encounter, which I found was sort of a familiar process for different types of travellers, whether they be international students or workers who might be moving there for only a couple of years, or migrants. So I was looking particularly at this initial stage of adapting to an unfamiliar culture. And I was focused particularly on ways of perceiving and the influence of past experiences in influencing this perception. So in order to kind of investigate that, I was looking at, I mean, there's lots of overwhelming amount of information when you first enter into a new culture. So I was taking frames, if you like. So I was taking photos to sort of highlight the different details that I was seeing and to put them under the microscope, and also to kind of have a process where I could reflect in a slower way. So I was kind of recording things, going back and thinking and reflecting on them, thinking about what am I missing and what am I framing and what's left out of the frame. So then I started to write haiku as a response to the poem, to the image, thinking about what's outside the frame, what's not said, and also questioning where I was putting my attention, where I was directing my attention. So here is a few of the pieces that I was working on from Nam, Mesot, and Singapore, and also in Barcelona. And so then I was also thinking though about this idea of how past experience might be shaping what I pay attention to or where I'm directing my attention. So then I started to work with other tools like repetition and juxtaposition. And I was looking at forms like the pantun as a very kind of repetitive form that recontextualized. So I'd sort of have the line, and then as you put it later on in a different context, it was sort of a way to look again at that perception or that line in a different context and think, what is this change of context? What kind of new insights am I getting from that? And it also slowed down my race to become familiar and comfortable in the place, and kind of encouraged me to question a bit more what I was including and how I was including it. So I used it, repetition and juxtaposition, to reflect on my possible assumptions and blind spots through a type of slow thinking built into the creative process. The juxtaposition encouraged me to use surprise as a way to disrupt the initial apparent meaning schemes and break away from automated or routine ways of practicing. And in this way, I sought to question my habitus and retain these cycles of questioning and revisions within the poem, within the structure of the final poem. So these poetic tools of framing, of using particular forms and repetition and juxtaposition were sort of interesting for my practice. But then I wanted to think about how might this be applicable to another creative practice. So this is where I developed what I called reflective frames, which is borrowing from an adapting philosopher and urban planner, planning professor Donald Schoen's term frame experiments. So Schoen explains these experiments by describing a moment when a practitioner, and I quote, finds himself stuck in a problematic situation which he cannot readily convert into a manageable problem, and at which point he may construct a new way of setting the problem, a new frame which he tries to impose on the situation, end quote. Schoen outlines in more detail how this process develops. In each instance, the practitioner allows himself to experience surprise, puzzlement, or confusion in a situation which he finds uncertain or unique. He reflects on the phenomena before him and on the prior understandings which have been implicit in his behaviour, carries out an experiment which serves to generate both new understanding of the phenomena and a change in the situation. I particularly was interested in using this in the editing process. So after deciding that I was going to focus on this area of cultural meeting or encounters and adapting to a new cultural place, and after kind of developing my practice, I would then, as a way to reflect, I would sort of test these statements out. So I had 5, which were statements like, I do not understand all that I see. I have biases that influence how I see and write. My poetic choices are not always the best choices in an unfamiliar cultural context. The intention of the poem is not always what I think it is. And I'm speaking for as opposed to speaking to. So the frames are intended as statements that can be tried on and tested during the editing process, with the aim of challenging prior understandings which have been implicit in my behaviour, by constructing new ways of setting or framing the problem. The statement of each reflective frame are not intended to be taken as true. Rather, they are firstly to focus on specific challenges in culturally unfamiliar places, to give oneself permission to make mistakes and challenge oneself within the editing process, and to try on diverse perspectives. The statements are intended to challenge, but they are also a way of acknowledging the mistakes writers make and the challenges they face when writing about an unfamiliar culture. The concept is to reflect on these shortcomings, not necessarily to fix them, but to rather engage with the complexity of writing in this space. The reflective frames encourage an approach of lifelong learning when writing about an unfamiliar culture, in which one's own position as a beginner is embraced. The statements are an additional layer to the editing process, and their focus is on the cultural encounter with the unfamiliar and on the creative decision a writer is making when engaging culturally. These reflective frames also address creative practice researcher Linda Candy's observation that without a clear and systematic process in place, a practice is unable to analyse where things worked well or went wrong. an evaluation that is important when trying to avoid repeating mistakes. These reflective frames address this issue of transparency by applying a similar reflective process to all poems, with the aim of learning and moving forward at each step of the reflective cycle. The reflective frames are intended as a way to step enough outside our current way of thinking and feeling that we have a chance to alter not just our behaviour, but the reality shaping beliefs and assumptions that give rise to our behaviour, and potentially challenge the creative choices. So these were the reflective frames that came out of my PhD research, and it sort of felt very particular to someone who is already committed to writing in these spaces or creating work in these spaces. And I began to think, how might this be adapted, this approach and these kind of particular challenges to cultural adaptation? How could they be adapted to someone who has a more passing interest, or who perhaps is visiting, or perhaps maybe isn't even a creative practitioner, but someone, a more general public. So this is where the Postcard Exchange began to develop. So it explores the making and sharing of micro multimedia postcards of about 5 minutes as a way to investigate ways of perceiving in unfamiliar cultural places. So the structure of it, more or less, is that there would be some kind of image and audio from a place, and that there would be a text as well, with the idea of kind of mixing them together in a way that kind of highlights juxtaposition and different ways of perceiving in a place. So not just the visual, but also the oral as well, and reflecting upon that through text. It's very based in place and explores feelings, impressions, frames about a place. And it's trying to evoke a sense of creative play. So this idea also came out of where I'm living at the moment, which is Barcelona, and it's a very touristic city. And it has mass tourism, and it's a real problem or a tension between the people who live here, the locals, and the tourists who kind of come through. And I was thinking also about the use of images, that we travel to places and we potentially take images of the same big objects, the very impressive big monuments of a city. So we're all kind of taking similar kind of images and then leaving. And then I was thinking, well, what does that really tell about a place? I was also thinking about what they're trying to do here to as a way to manage mass tourism as well, is to try and direct people to other parts of the city. So not just the big monuments like the Sagrada Familia or the Ramblas, but also to other neighborhoods which perhaps aren't as spectacular, but in a way it's more true to what life is like in Barcelona. And I think that is sometimes the case, where the people who live here sort of avoid all these other touristy areas and they're really living in other spaces. So I thought this is like a creative way to get maybe visitors to engage with different places in a city. But then I was also interested in how a local and a visitor might be sharing their perceptions about a place, or their explorations about a place, in a more kind of open and curious way. So instead of having like, this is our city and you should go, it's more like, well, what can a visitor also provide, or what kind of new insights can they give about a city that could be interesting to people who live there as well? So to have a more creative dialogue and encounter through kind of a fun, engaging and creative engagement with the place. The idea is that it would be in fragments. So it's not that it's not necessarily storytelling, and you don't have to come to a conclusion about a place. It's more, what's my perception of what I'm seeing in front of me right now, and not needing to draw a conclusion about that. So that's why I've particularly tried to keep it short. So it's just insights and different fragments. So you might have this perception here now, but if you come back in 2 months or a year, you might have a different perception. Or even as the time goes past, throughout a whole week, you might have different fragments that sort of build up to a way of perceiving a place. All right. And I think the last element that I wanted to mention about it is that I was trying to design it in a way that's playful and has a particular structure. So what I found useful about using haiku and pantun was that as I was going through these topics, I felt that there was a big responsibility to do it well, to get it right, and that these were very heavy topics, and it was sort of hanging heavily in the poems that I was trying to create. So I found that using a structure like a pantun, which is sort of very strict and a bit, I don't know if some might think it's a bit gimmicky, but I found it as a way to kind of play and to step away a bit from the topics that I was dealing with, and to use the structure. Yeah, I mean, as a way to give myself permission to experiment and play and be a bit more lighthearted with it. So that's what I was trying to create a structure with this the postcard exchange that had a bit of those elements in it as well. So it could be that there would be prompts for people doing this as well. So, you know, find something that can fit in the palm of your hand. So it's a bit like a treasure hunt to then find this, but then to go a bit deeper and think about, well, what am I hearing here? What are my thoughts about this? Does this remind me of another place? And then to start to delve a bit deeper into our responses to a place, or what we're seeing in a place. So I think at this point, I'll just show you an example of one that I was fiddling with, which is actually from Phillip Island in Australia, Southeast Australia, to give you an idea about what one example might look like.
Waves rock
Here
the
I sit
pools.
in your fading light.
I see the wash, but all I hear is the battering airstream.
What will I wear to your funeral?
Currents that swirl the world as I'm left winded on the cliff top.
It's less urgent here.
For now, from here,
The edge where grief gathers.
you look the same. My soul slips on the gravel.
Jagged edges snare the sea.
A noose of phlegm grips the
And
windpipe.
underneath, your soft belly.
Jagged edges snare the sea, and underneath,
Your
a
soft
noose of
belly
phlegm.
grips the windpipe.
The edge where grief gathers.
My soul slips on the gravel. For now, from here, you look the same.
What will I wear to your funeral?
Waves rock the pools. I see the wash, but all I hear is the battering airstream. Currents that swirl the world as I'm left winded on
Here
the
I
cliff
sit
top.
in your fading light.
All right, so I'll leave that there, and maybe so the idea from here is to so this project is still in its early stages, and the idea is maybe potentially to open this up for doing workshops and exchange. So that's also partly the invitation here today, is if anyone's interested or intrigued in the project, then we can have some online workshops to think through these topics.
Okay, thank you, Claire. That was really, really fascinating, and yeah, delightful to spend the time just thinking through the work you're doing and the ideas you're raising. I want to open the floor to any questions or discussion, but I'll just warn everybody in advance that you are being recorded for future video watching and also possible podcast. So do keep that in mind, that you are actually consenting to having your voice broadcast elsewhere if you do speak. Can people use the hand raise function? And then I'll invite you to unmute yourself and use the microphone. So if anyone would like to make any comments or raise any questions. Jen.
It's not not so much a question. Clara, I want to say how wonderful it is to hear you speak this work out, because I watched you making it over those years and watched your thinking develop. And you are an example of what happens when we start thinking carefully about our poetry and its context. So I just want to say thank you. It was lovely to hear you talk and see the work again.
Thank you, Jen.
Look, I might make a comment or raise a sort of question at this point. Claire, one of the things I was thinking as you talked through the reflective frames is that the tourist's vision, the sort of habituated and stereotyped vision, on one level, it's kind of useless for art, and it's the opposite of art, and in some ways the opposite of intercultural, complex interaction. But on another level, it is a kind of an access point to something quite different. Like, it strikes me that you're using that touristic gaze, if we can call it that, dialectically as a pointer to something else, something beyond. So I thought I'd just raise that and see what you think.
Yeah, and I think I'm sort of finding that, like, tackling it from tourism is not particularly popular, and I sort of, as you say, it's kind of an entry point. Firstly, it's something that perhaps many of us do as well. So it's in here. There's like a lot of locals saying, "Oh, tourists go home," but then they're also traveling somewhere else and becoming a tourist somewhere else. So, and I don't think it's a terrible thing to want to go somewhere else and explore a different culture and to kind of be curious about it, and to say, no to tourism. You're sort of saying, well, no, we shouldn't be exploratory. We shouldn't think about it. But I think it's a matter of maybe thinking about a different way of doing it, and that's kind of one sort of traveler. And with this this idea that I have, I wanted to kind of tackle many different ways of this encounter. So whether it's tourism, whether it's an international student who stays for 3 years, whether it's a migrant who stays for 20 years, whether it's someone who's lived there all their life and then they kind of don't see things anymore. And so this could be a way to explore their own place with new eyes, or to go down different roads or different suburbs. So it's kind of, I sort of saw this as a big problem, and I thought, well, maybe I see the mass tourism as something that needs to be addressed more urgently. So I guess that's sort of where I'm taking it. But I guess it's a way to be, to try and encourage. I think, even if you are like this tourist taking these typical photos, it doesn't mean that you're not interested, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and engage in a deeper reflection about place. So this was kind of my entry point to trick people into being a bit more reflective about where they are and how they're seeing it.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I'll raise one other question. Well, reflection perhaps. I was thinking about Susan Stewart's work on postcards. And one of the things she points out is that a postcard has an indexical function in the sense that it has meaning because you've actually been in that place. Like, if you send a postcard from a place that you haven't actually visited, there's something that's kind of illegitimate about that communication, which is why it can be a fun thing to do. But it does kind of violate our expectations of what postcards are. And I'm wondering if you, in the postcard project, is it essential that someone was there? If you know what I mean, is that linked to being there an essential part of the communication? Could it be a fictional visit?
Yeah, and
open those sort of questions, and then we'll come to got a question too.
That's something that I'm playing with this project as well. Firstly, I'm not sure about the title of being a postcard, because it does have, as you say, the expectations around it, and it's also linked more with, I guess, a traditional way of doing tourism, or fast tourism, where you sort of buy a postcard of a typical place, write quickly on it, and then send it off. And it's kind of, I was wondering if calling it that, I'm kind of challenging that idea, or if it doesn't sort of, or if I'm kind of setting up false expectations. But one thing that I was curious about exploring is different ways of thinking or exploring about unfamiliar places. So this idea of what can you get to know about a place without actually being there as well. Because I was thinking about this idea of this need to go to all these fantastic places and to see them firsthand, to only then kind of take the picture that everybody else takes of that place and then to rush off. Like, what are you really experiencing about that place? Why do you actually have to be there when you don't see much more than all these other images that you see online? So the thought that I had was, well, what happens if we sort of look at all those images about that place? What happens if then we look at a postcard from a resident of that place? How does that make us understand that place? And is it possible to like share images and sound and kind of remix them and what does that teach us about that particular place, or the exchange with the person that you're thinking with? So I guess as part of this project, another experiment that I was wanting to do is that I have a sort of a short residency in Split in Croatia, which has similar challenges that there are in Barcelona. So then I was wanting to collaborate with an artist there before going, as a way to kind of share images and sound and kind of exchange about a place. And then what sense of that place do I get before I go, and then to actually go there and explore the place through my own creative practice while there. So then that was the idea, to kind of say, do we have to go everywhere all the time, or is there another way of exchanging about place without having such a high carbon footprint all the time? So that was kind of something that I'm keen to explore.
Yeah, I think that's lovely, and it raises the possibility that in many ways we've already arrived, even before getting there. I'll pass to Katie.
Oh, hi Claire, it's Katie Hayne here. Can you hear me okay? Sorry, I'm on my phone.
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
Oh, great. Thanks, Claire, for a lovely presentation. It was really fabulous to see your work, having also seen it in various iterations over the years as part of the faculty staff exhibitions that you've submitted your work. And I'm really interested in the format of the video poem that you use, and thinking particularly about your decisions when you're using image and text together. And in the one you showed today, you had your voice in there, and I was interested in how you feel about how those different combinations of image, text and voice bring in you as the author of the work, and whether you can talk about that at all.
Yeah, so I guess I was very interested in the different media, particularly audio. It became increasingly important, sort of found sounds as well in a place to give a different impression of place. And at the beginning I was sort of looking more at text on screen as opposed to necessarily having to have a voice, also because I don't know, I'm not a performance poet. I don't feel like I execute that super successfully, but I think there is something to be said to have one's own voice in the video poem is to sort of be clear of who's speaking, of whose perceptions it is, and yeah, and I guess so I'm not sure if that's kind of the question, or if it's how I've come to mix the text with the image and the juxtaposition. But I guess in creating it, sometimes it was the images that led. So the images about a place that sort of started the idea, and then sometimes in the text I was merging between writing about the place and writing about sort of the memories that it might bring up, which could have been somewhere else. So that's kind of the translocal approach that I had, that I was layering different places, because that's how you experience things as well. It's not just about being in Barcelona or being in Phillip Island and that's all that I'm thinking about, but it's sort of the different places that I've been also infiltrate into that. So I was wanting to highlight those different places as well through, sometimes it was the text, sometimes it was the sound, and sometimes I would be changing the image. But I think, yeah, I think having your own voice perhaps in this particular project could be interesting or important, as to say, this is my perception of a place, as opposed to being a bit more generic. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, no, that's exactly I think what I was feeling too when I was hearing your voice. So a very strong presence of you in the work. So yes, thank you.
Alex.
Okay, thanks Claire, that was really lovely. I'm wondering about the reflective frames, and which you developed during a PhD and now you're applying in real practice. Which ones have surprised you? Which ones are more useful for you? Which ones are not quite so useful? How are they working out?
Yeah, I'll just pull it up so that so I guess the first two I find maybe the most useful, so I don't understand all that I see and I have biases.
Mm-hmm.
And that influence how I see and how I write, or how I perceive and how I write. And the others, I think, because I think those are the more complex ones. It's sort of, it starts from where you're directing your attention, what kind of poem you're writing, what you're writing about. And so I feel that they're deeper frames that have to go through the whole process from the very beginning. And it's something that you can easily kind of slip up on when you're creating. Whereas the other ones I feel like are more checks, you know, my poetic choices perhaps isn't the best choice. So in that regards, it could be, it could be, for example, in one poem that I was writing about a politically sensitive topic, and I was sort of using it to make another point in my writing, and I was wondering, am I kind of being a bit light about this very heavy topic, and I'm just sort of scratching the surface and using it as a tool for my ambition in the poem, as opposed to really delving a bit deeper into the sensitivities around it, or the, like, it's a very profound moment in the history of this culture. Should I really be taking this, cherry picking it and kind of using it? So it's more of a, I feel like that one, for example, is more of a check. And the intention of the poem, I guess, that's just kind of double checking those kind of things, no? But the first two, yeah, I feel is something that needs more time. And
the first two are very grounded in all sorts of design thinking approaches and all the rest. So yes, absolutely grounded in that. Supplementary question: have you found the need to develop more frames?
Yeah, I guess it's something that still needs to be developed. I sort of look at it sometimes and I'm like, oh, is it a bit too simplistic? And as we're talking now, you know, like these two frames are different, need to be applied at different points than the other frames. So I do wonder if it needs more fine tuning and maybe different times at which to apply it, or a different sort of process that could go through. I don't know if to have more could then just feel very arduous.
Yeah. There's certainly different ways of applying, and different parts of the process, and different ways of helping you think in different situations as well. I think that might be quite fruitful.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
I wonder if there couldn't be a frame troped around being gullible.
The gullible truth.
Rather than being skeptical of your initial assumptions, being foolish or gullible in relation to some of them.
Yeah, and I think definitely stopping at the surface as well. So whether it's being gullible, and I think like when you're getting familiar with a place, and everything's new and it's exciting, but then it gets to a point where it's overwhelming and it's a bit scary, and you just want something comfortable. You want something you can say, okay, I know this now, I know where I am. And I think that's also a point where you have to say, okay, we need to go a bit deeper here. Sort of, this isn't right. You know, it's not the end point to have this initial level of comfort to say, okay, I know a bit about this and I know a bit about that. You still need to keep going deeper. So yeah, and I think that sort of fits in with maybe the gullible, or sort of just stopping at a point of understanding and not going further.
Any further comments or questions? Jen suggested maybe naive rather than gullible.
And I mean that in a nice way. This is the innocent way. The world was sort of not very aware eyes, and just see what comes at you.
Yeah, and I think this is it's an ongoing process for 20 years or something. Like I think you can always come back and reflect, okay, where am I now? What kind of assumptions do I have now, and how are they formed? Maybe they're formed by family or formed by the groups of people that I know in this particular place, but that doesn't mean that I haven't got more learning to do.
And maybe time is a big part of that. You said it takes 20 years, but just staying for 10 minutes rather than for 1 minute at that tourist trap, for instance, you start seeing beyond the obvious postcard, maybe something of the actual life of the place. Francesca Rendleshall always used to urge us to linger. She liked that word. Say linger. See what the work will do if you linger with it. And I like that.
Yeah, and I think you have a point that it's to stay that little bit longer than perhaps you're comfortable with as well. So not just to sort of take the photo and leave, but then to look around a bit and to linger, as you say.
Okay. Well, look, I think we'll basically bring things to a close, but actually not a close at all, because having now presented to us online, Claire is coming to visit and will be presenting in person to us in the seminar series in second semester. So we'll be, having a kind of multimedia experience of this work. And also it's linked to Person in Place. And that seminar is, I think it's around about the 10th of August, we've said, somewhere more or less around there, around the first week of August, where we'll see the development of this work on the Donald Horne Fellowship with the CCCR. And hopefully I'll see many of you in 2 weeks' time as well. So please join me in thanking Claire for a really lovely presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
That's a great pleasure, and we'll all see you in a few months.
Sounds great.
Okay. Bye, everyone.